Sheena Easton, the Scottish lass. It's a great bubblegum pop song. Class in Australia, we'd love your views on this. 1300 222 891, 0467 922 891. There's a book of essays on this, Class in Australia. It's edited by Associate Professor Stephen Threadgold of the University of Newcastle. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having us on.
I love Newcastle.
That's great.
Do you go to the bogey hole?
Yeah, pretty regular actually.
Good. And Jessica Gerrard, also an Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne. Hello, Jessica. Hello, Jessica? No, we don't see her. Are you... Oh, she's breathing. Are you there, Jessica? Oh, that's very odd, Stephen.
Yes.
How did you come together to edit this book?
Class has been a concern of both our research over the past decade or so. And in particular, we've noticed, I suppose, more generally that the class is something that isn't talked about much in, our media and politics and things like that. So we decided a couple of years ago to have like a workshop seminar where we invited people around, researchers around Australia, to come present their research, and the book kind of came together out of that.
And they have.
Yeah.
We've often regarded as a classless society, which is a sort of a beautiful lie, isn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think, one of the only really time we hear our kind of leaders talk about class is like when they mention something like a class war, anytime someone tries to redistribute wealth, so, yeah, I think class is an important way of thinking about inequality because it shows, that it's rather systematic rather than, individual, I suppose.
I think, there should be more talk of the underclass, which is highly prevalent in Australia, the dispossessed, that underclass. Class structure is less rigid than it once was, is it not?
Did you say the class structure is less rigid?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it depends how you look at that, really. I mean, inequality itself is rising more than ever. I mean, the gap between the extreme wealthy and everyone else really is rising more than ever before. It's more difficult to say whether there's the wealth at the bottom is kind of getting worse. It does seem to me that what we know is that more and more people up and down the class spectrum feel precarious, whether that's, more casualised labour, worried about the future in all kinds of different ways. So in that sense, classes can be measured economically, but we're also very interested in what it means culturally and symbolically and even emotionally.
There have been, the idea of the quiet Australians, that the Menzies, the John Howard's battlers. This was a bit of a smokescreen, wasn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, we hear these kind of terminologies come up fairly regularly over the years and decades, and different politicians use them in different ways, I think, to kind of dog whistle towards particular groups in society. So I think one Morrison has used recently is the quiet Australian. And so what these terms generally point towards is a relatively kind of conservative middle class, nuclear family as the norm, and everyone else needs to kind of aspire to that or become that. And, you can imagine how problematic that is for most people. So in that sense, that class kind of dog whistling speaks to a particular normalised group, but, most of us don't actually fit that group.
We now welcome Jessica Gerrard, Associate Professor, University of Melbourne. You there, Jessica?
I am. Hi, Peter.
We've had a lot of heavy breathing.
I'm not sure what happened. The line dropped out, so
There's a text already on 0467 922 891, and we welcome your commentary here. The only people who think Australia is classless is those with money, enough not to worry about it. As a social worker here in South Australia, class very much exists. And yes, my grandparents, for example, were very proudly of the working class, and they didn't aspire to. That was where they sat, and that's where they identified. and for good or ill. My grandmother used to say, on trains and planes, well, she flew exactly once, and she'd say, "Do you know the reason we're in second class?" And I'd say no. She said, "Because there's no third class." That was knowing your place. I think to a degree that's changed. And if you moved out of your class, you were a counter jumper, they used to call you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes. We're talking class in Australia. Someone has said working families. You see, this is code for what? This is code for the battlers, isn't it? The middle class.
Well, working families is really a means to try and speak to a whole range of different kind of class relations there. It's trying to speak to an idea of what a good Australian is, a good citizen is, a good productive worker. Mm-hmm. And of course, on the other side of that, many people who go through long periods of unemployment, underemployment, precarious employment, which of course is becoming an increasingly problematic aspect of our social relations. So that kind of a term is speaking to a whole range of things, it kind of almost silently, like a whisper, but it's all there, and it's evoking very much a class idea of what it means to be an Australian.
You cite in the book, or one of the authors, because they're essays by different people, that property was, after all, the economic prop of gentility. And we saw this from the beginning of European settlement in Australia, the theft of land, the selections, the squatters, the squattocracy, which of course all entailed the dispossession of Aboriginal people, didn't it?
Indeed, and a big part of our intention with this book was to generate some further discussion about what class means in a place like Australia, which is a settler colony, which started with the theft of land, which started with the dispossession of people and land, and which started with, in the first instance, the exclusion of Indigenous people from the category of worker. And so we can't kind of begin to understand class relations in a place like Australia without reckoning with that in the first place.
Of course, yes, that disposition.
Yeah. And ironically, much of the early study of class in Australia ignored that as well. So it's not just...
And who said all nations are based on are founded on an act of forgetting? And, that is our great forgetting. We're remembering it now, and it's very prevalent now, but that... It was forgotten. It terra nullius. These people meant nothing. They were in the way. Move them on. Kill them. Dispossess them. Deny them citizenship. All of that.
Yeah, and we have a wonderful chapter in the collection, which is a conversation with Elizabeth Brandt, who talks about many aspects of that history.
Yes, I was less impressed with those essays because those sort of interviews are, I think, lazy. I'm sorry, yes, but however, nonetheless, they're interesting people. What about the term bogan? Now, we've just used it. I was speaking to a friend and a colleague in Broken Hill, and there's that show Housos about housing trust people in Sydney, and they've been filming an episode of that in Broken Hill. But I'm a bit nervous about the term bogan, although it does have kind of fond connotations, doesn't it?
Yeah, I might take that one because I've written a bit about bogans myself. So what's interesting about something like bogan is that most countries have a term for kind of, vulgar working class people. It tends to be different around the world. There's the chav in the UK and the bogan in Australia and other terminology of it. What I find interesting about it is that, I think in recent times it has become a little bit more humoristic, but the comedy is often produced by people, that are in the middle class, right? So it tends to be like a downward laughter. That's not to say that more recently there has been some more reclaiming of the term, but it generally... the term bogan stands in for people of bad taste and bad manners and stuff like that. But what the research tends to show too is, different people will have different versions of that, and some people being called bogan by someone might actually be called a bogan by someone else. So the boundaries between these things are a little bit shifty.
Indeed, and I'm a bit nervous about the word, but I don't know it's going to disappear.
Yeah, and we have a great chapter in the book as well, where that some of our authors have traced the genealogy of it back, decades to previous examples in Australia.
How much of upper class is moneyed, Jessica? Look at the legislative councils in this country were originally meant to be a sort of pseudo House of Lords. That democracy was all very well, but let's refer everything to wealthy landowners white men who formed the legislative councils in every state bar Queensland to decide whether we really want this. It can be the House of Review. So is this really good for the landed gentry, Jessica?
Well, that's right. I mean, our form of democracy is based in large part on, the mother of empire, England, and its form. And whilst we have obviously different kind of parliamentary organisations, it's still premised on this idea of landed gentry. And no matter how much, Australia is an interesting place to think about this, because we like to think of ourselves as being away from that, as having formed a different kind of democracy, which is in many ways the people's democracy. But in actuality, the way that is expressed in the contemporary day is just not the case. And that's not just about who is in power and who in government. It's also about influence in government. It's about kind of the power of corporate influence and corporate money in capitalist democracies. We just can't get away from it.
Stephen Threadgold?
Yes.
Do you wish to add to that?
Well, I totally agree. If I could kind of sum it up, if it's not the landed gentry anymore, our kind of political class seem to be in service to corporations as much as anything else. So you can see that constantly the way that things are funded and the rhetoric of day-to-day life in our politics.
Thanks to the Howard government particularly, and subsequent governments have done nothing to alter this, even Labor governments, we've seen an enormous rise of private schools, including the very elite private schools, very expensive private schools, which are heavily funded by governments. The snobbery that I've been, I think, and many Australians would say the same. I've suffered from the snobbery of private school people. Not all, of course, but some. And there's a whole chapter on private schools in this book, isn't there?
Well, private schooling is a really interesting one, because Australia is, one of the most has one of the most significant amounts of private schooling in it. We often think about, a country like the US as being ahead of us in the kind of disaster of corporatisation, or privatisation, but actually in terms of education, Australia is leading the pack in terms of the privatisation of education. And in Australia, what's interesting is the way that it's been framed politically and culturally has become a matter of kind of entitlement to parent choice, an entitlement to choose a culture or a value that might reflect your own family. And what's hidden underneath that is these, as you say, significant portions of elitism, of privilege, and all of the inequalities that come with that.
It's beggaring the public school system, which was once the pride of the world, our public school system. But so much funding is going to very, very wealthy corporate private schools, often the wealthiest, not the worthiest, but the wealthiest. How does this happen, Stephen?
I think very simply it's a perfect working example of how class in our society works. I mean, I would hazard a guess that many of political representatives come from those schools, and many of the people that are in the boardrooms of our corporations come from there as well. It seems to be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And this is the English model. I mean, 2/3 of Boris Johnson's cabinet in England went to private schools, particularly Eton. And
Yeah, I
that's
think a lot of people
twice
do
as
that.
high as the cabinet members who went to private schools in Theresa May's cabinet.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it sounds yeah, very much, very true. Totally understand. And as we all see that government working in that way, in the way that they treat the populace.
But is that to create a network of power, Stephen, in our private?
Without a doubt. So,
yes.
It's private schools themselves, I mean, it's dubious in terms of actual, education outcomes in terms of the marks that students get, how much they make a difference. But what they do is open doors to all the right networks, knowing the right people, and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, definitely.
What about the reverse snobbery of class? Now, I sit here nightly exaggerating my working class roots. We were too poor to eat carrots, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of that, isn't there? How does that impact class, Jessica?
Well, I mean, I think that people's relationships to class are formed through a whole range of things. It's how we've understand ourselves, and you opened with a really interesting reflection on your own grandparents, and I think often we understand these things generationally, intergenerationally, and how our own family and community have understood itself in relationship to class, which is where you can get into really interesting territory around how people might reject or attach themselves to different class locations in the sense of their own identity, the pride, or the refusal to it, a desire to turn away from those kind of explanations for understanding their position in society.
It's also area-based, isn't it? That you belong to this sort of area, and this sort of area is this sort of class, and that's where you stay. Now, it's not as bad as it used to be, but growing up in the western suburbs of Adelaide, we never went to the eastern suburbs. We didn't know anyone there. I think I was 15 and I had to go to an emergency appointment to my orthodontist in a very posh suburb. We'd never been there.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's happening in this topic as well is that people don't like talking about their own privilege and don't like to acknowledge it sometimes as well. So there's in terms of the reverse of the reverse is kind of true, right? Is that everyone, there's a real discourse that everyone works hard, and if you make the right choices, everyone assume that you'll be able to put your choices into place, that kind of meritocratic ideal. So people that are going to the schools with huge football fields and rowing and orchestras and all that kind of stuff tend to not really want to talk about that aspect.
No, they don't. Or they demean it, or they apologise for it.
Yeah, they do.
Yes, or they call, say, St Peter's College, they'll call that Hackney High here in Adelaide. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating topic and a fascinating book, and I think you were right when you said at the outset, it's not talked about, and yet it's part of the fabric of our lives, Stephen Threadgold.
Yeah, it is, and thanks for having us on to be able to talk about it.
Not at all.
We appreciate it.
Associate Professors Stephen Threadgold and Jessica Gerrard, Class in Australia. Thank you very much, both of you.